In 2017, Venezuela was already in crisis. Hyperinflation was spiraling out of control, people were fleeing by the thousands, and the government of Nicolás Maduro was tightening its grip on power. But what happened next would transform a severe economic crisis into an absolute catastrophe. The United States, frustrated with Maduro's authoritarian crackdown and the collapse of Venezuelan democracy, decided to deploy its most powerful economic weapon, comprehensive sanctions targeting the country's oil industry. What followed was one of the most devastating economic collapses in modern history, shrinking Venezuela's economy by over 75% in just 6 years. To understand the impact, you need to understand what oil means to Venezuela. This isn't just another oil-producing country. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, surpassing even Saudi Arabia with over 300 billion barrels. Oil wasn't just important to Venezuela's economy. It was the economy. At its peak, oil accounted for 95% of Venezuela's export revenue and over 50% of government income. Every social program, every government salary, every infrastructure project depended on oil money flowing into state coffers. The state oil company, PDVSA, was once among the most powerful energy corporations in the world, producing 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s. But by 2017, Venezuela's oil production was already declining due to years of mismanagement, underinvestment, and corruption under Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro. Production had fallen to around 2 million barrels per day, and the industry was struggling. Then came the sanctions, and the bottom fell out completely. In August 2017, the Trump administration issued Executive Order 13,808, prohibiting American companies and citizens from dealing in new Venezuelan debt or equity. This might sound technical, but it cut off Venezuela's ability to refinance its massive debts. The country owed over $150 billion to foreign creditors and desperately needed to restructure these obligations. Suddenly, that option vanished. But the real hammer fell in January 2019. After Maduro's contested re-election and the political crisis that saw opposition leader Juan Guaidó declare himself interim president, the United States imposed comprehensive oil sector sanctions. Executive Order 13,850 prohibited American companies from purchasing Venezuelan oil or providing goods and services to PDVSA. This was devastating because the United States had been Venezuela's largest oil customer, importing over 500,000 barrels per day, worth roughly $11 billion annually. Overnight, Venezuela lost its primary market and its main source of hard currency. The immediate impact was catastrophic. Venezuelan oil production collapsed from around 1.5 million barrels per day in early 2019 to under 400,000 barrels per day by 2020. By 2023, production had stabilized around 700,000 barrels per day, still less than a quarter of what the country produced 2 decades earlier. This wasn't just about losing American customers. The sanctions had secondary effects that rippled through the entire oil industry. American companies that had provided crucial technical services, equipment, and spare parts to Venezuelan oil fields were forbidden from doing business with PDVSA. Venezuela's oil infrastructure, already aging and poorly maintained, began failing at an accelerating rate. Oil wells require constant maintenance. Pumps break down, pipes corrode, refineries need replacement parts and specialized chemicals. Venezuela had relied heavily on American suppliers for these essentials. When sanctions cut off these supplies, oil fields that could have continued producing for years were abandoned. Refineries that could have been repaired sat idle. The technical expertise that American companies provided disappeared. PDVSA tried to find alternative suppliers from China, Russia, and Iran, but these arrangements were complicated, expensive, and often ineffective. Many international companies refused to risk doing business with Venezuela for fear of violating US sanctions and losing access to American markets. The financial sanctions compounded the damage. In 2019, the US Treasury Department sanctioned PDVSA directly and froze roughly $7 billion in Venezuelan assets held in the United States. This included assets of CITGO, Venezuela's crown jewel, a refining and marketing company based in the United States that operated 3 refineries and thousands of gas stations. Citgo had been one of PDVSA's most valuable and profitable assets, generating billions in revenue. Suddenly, Venezuela lost control of this asset and its revenue stream. The sanctions also targeted Venezuela's gold exports, another crucial source of foreign currency. The US imposed secondary sanctions, threatening to punish any company that purchased Venezuelan gold, effectively cutting off international markets. The Bank of England refused to release $1.95 billion worth of Venezuelan gold stored in its vaults, citing concerns about governance and the legitimacy of the Maduro government. Venezuela's gold reserves, once an emergency backup, became inaccessible. Now, here's where it gets complicated and controversial. Supporters of the sanctions argue they were necessary and morally justified. The Maduro government had systematically dismantled Venezuelan democracy, arrested opposition leaders, rigged elections, and violently suppressed protests. International observers documented severe human rights abuses. The sanctions were designed to pressure Maduro to step down, allow free elections, and restore democracy. The logic was that economic pressure would either force regime change or at least limit the government's ability to fund its repressive apparatus. Critics of the sanctions tell a different story. They argue that while Maduro's government was undoubtedly corrupt and authoritarian, the sanctions didn't hurt the regime as much as they devastated ordinary Venezuelans. The government and military elite found ways to survive. They controlled smuggling networks, engaged in gold mining operations, and maintained access to resources through connections with China, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Meanwhile, regular citizens bore the brunt of the economic collapse. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Malnutrition rates skyrocketed. Inflation made salaries worthless. The monthly minimum wage in Venezuela at its worst fell to the equivalent of less than $5 per month. Independent economic studies have attempted to quantify the sanctions' impact. A 2019 report by economists Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs estimated that sanctions were responsible for over 40,000 deaths between 2017 and 2018 alone, primarily through their impact on healthcare and nutrition. The study was controversial and disputed by sanctions supporters, but it highlighted the human cost. By 2021, the United Nations estimated that 94% of Venezuelans lived in poverty. 7 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the population, fled the country, creating the largest refugee crisis in Latin American history. Colombia alone absorbed over 2 million Venezuelan refugees. The counter-argument points out that Venezuela's economy was already collapsing before the harshest sanctions took effect. Hyperinflation began in 2016, driven by years of economic mismanagement, price controls, currency manipulation, and the destruction of private enterprise under socialist policies. Oil production was already declining due to corruption and underinvestment at PDVSA long before American sanctions. From this perspective, the sanctions accelerated and deepened a crisis that Maduro's own policies created. The government had expelled thousands of skilled oil workers for political reasons, seized foreign company assets without compensation, and drove away international investment through arbitrary rule changes and corruption. But the timing tells a revealing story. Venezuela's GDP contracted by about 16% in 2016 and 14% in 2017. Severe, but not unprecedented. Then came the oil sanctions in 2019, and the contraction accelerated dramatically. The economy shrank by an additional 25% in 2019 and 30% in 2020. The collapse of oil revenues was the proximate cause of this acceleration. The government lost the ability to import food, medicine, and basic goods. State services collapsed. The currency became worthless, forcing many Venezuelans to adopt the US dollar informally for transactions. The geopolitical dimension adds another layer of complexity. The sanctions didn't exist in isolation. They were part of a broader US strategy to isolate Maduro internationally and support the opposition. The US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president and encouraged allies to do the same. Over 50 countries followed suit. The US also imposed sanctions on individuals in Maduro's inner circle, targeting their ability to travel and access international banking. but other powers saw an opportunity. China and Russia, already significant creditors and allies of Venezuela, deepened their involvement. China had lent Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, mostly in loans for oil deals. Russia's Rosneft became deeply involved in Venezuelan oil operations, helping to circumvent sanctions through complex ship-to-ship transfers and middlemen. Iran, itself heavily sanctioned by the United States, formed an alliance with Venezuela based on mutual isolation. Iranian tankers delivered gasoline and condensate to Venezuela when the country's refineries failed. Iranian technical experts helped repair Venezuelan oil infrastructure. These relationships allowed Venezuela to survive, but came at a cost. The deals were opaque, corrupt, and heavily tilted in favor of the helping countries. Venezuela mortgaged its future, promising oil deliveries for years to come at discounted prices. The sanctions regime evolved over time, becoming more complex and far-reaching. The US targeted shipping companies that transported Venezuelan oil, insurance companies that covered Venezuelan shipments, and financial institutions that processed Venezuelan transactions. This created a global compliance nightmare. Even companies not directly involved with Venezuela became cautious, fearing they might inadvertently violate sanctions through indirect connections. This overcompliance, or the chilling effect, extended the sanctions' reach far beyond their explicit terms. By 2020, Venezuela was operating a shadow oil economy. PDVSA used front companies, falsified documents, turned off ship transponders, and engaged in ship-to-ship transfers in international waters to hide oil shipments. Oil that was officially going to one destination would be secretly rerouted to another. Buyers, primarily in China and to a lesser extent in India, Malaysia, and other Asian countries, acquired Venezuelan oil at steep discounts, sometimes $20 to $30 below market price per barrel. The Maduro government was getting a fraction of what it should have earned for its oil, but it was better than nothing. The humanitarian argument against sanctions gained traction internationally. The European Union, while critical of Maduro, never imposed oil sanctions comparable to those of the United States. European officials argued that economic pressure should be targeted at individuals and not entire sectors that affected civilian populations. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures condemned the US sanctions, calling them violations of human rights and international law. The US government rejected these criticisms, maintaining that the sanctions had humanitarian exemptions and that the humanitarian crisis was Maduro's fault, not the sanctions.